Oil. We use it daily, we need it for our everyday lives, and we have grown accustomed to having it readily available. But in reality, the oil supply is like a water tap that can go from full pressure to barely running in the blink of an eye. Oil has had a massive effect on the global economy, specifically in its Middle Eastern hub, where its volatile movements cause the most repercussions. Specifically, we focused on Kuwait's economy from the 1960s to the 2000s, which illustrates the events of the oil boom and the various economic and political factors that both shaped and were shaped by the market for this vital natural resource. This graph illustrates the impact of oil on the Kuwaiti economy through the comparison of exports as a percent of the GDP and income per person, as GDP per capita adjusted for inflation. Because oil makes up about 90% of Kuwait's economy, exports as a portion of the GDP is a telling measurement of the impact of oil on the economy. And because income per person is telling of the overall well-being of a country, it is an ideal base measurement for the x-axis. In Kuwait, income per person is extensively tied to oil production. 1961 is the year that Kuwait gained its independence from the British, as well as the beginning of Kuwait's data on Gapminder. Oil reserves were discovered in Kuwait around the 1930s, but after World War II and Kuwait's independence, the market started to boom. The first data points that are found for Kuwait show the exports as accounting for 65% of the country's GDP and an income per person of $35,050, a modest but solid starting point. 1973 to 1974 shows the first huge increase in exports due to the first oil embargo. The first oil embargo was imposed by OPEC members on the countries that supported Israel. This led to a quadrupling of oil prices because the US was desperate for oil. As you can see on the map, the percent of GDP from exports went from 72% to 85%, along with the income per capita, which rose from $63,120 to $122,500 in a quick jump. The 1980s saw a steady decline in oil prices around the world, partly due to increased supply from non-OPEC producers and political strain on the region due to the Iran-Iraq War. Often referred to as the oil glut, this decrease in price is reflected in the movement to the left and downward on the Gapminder graph. The GDP of Kuwait, like that of other OPEC nations, shrunk significantly in this decade. In 9 years, the income per person went from an astounding $115,000 to just under $50,000, and exports fell from 78% to 52% of the GDP. That's an over 50% decrease in income per person. Unlike the other events that we will look at in this video, the oil glut was not a drastic change from one year to the next, but rather a steady downward trend for many consecutive years. It's time for a global connection. It is clear in this graph that the whole region's production of oil was affected. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq have the same patterned movement as Kuwait, illustrating the immense international impact of the oil glut. The Gapminder graph and data from 1990 and 1991 show how detrimental political and military conflict are to a country's economy. In the summer of 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait and occupied the country until the US-led Operation Desert Storm pushed them out the following year, which took a tremendous toll on oil production. The income per capita in 1991 was less than half of what it had been just 2 years prior, and exports accounted for only 17% of GDP. Fortunately for the Kuwaiti economy, these measurements rose back up after the conflict just as quickly as they had fallen, with income per person returning to pre-conflict levels by 1993. The final data for the country is from 2011, and it shows exports accounting for 66% of the GDP, and the income per person at $82,470. In recent years, we can observe that the percentage of oil exports in GDP and income per person have become relatively stable. Due to the development of alternative energy resources and limited crude oil reserves, Kuwait is working to reconfigure its economic structures to the tertiary sector, a necessary step to keep up with the ever-changing global economy.